The mansion shimmered that night as though it were a palace carved out of dreams. Chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen cascades of light, their crystals scattering gold and silver across the polished marble floor. Long tables stretched beneath the glow, set with plates rimmed in pure gold, crystal glasses that caught the light like diamonds, and candles flickering in carefully measured elegance. The hum of conversation was soft yet charged, the sort of murmur only the wealthiest of investors, politicians, and media moguls could produce, every word laced with ambition, rivalry, and hidden agendas. Tonight was not merely a dinner, it was a showcase of power, and the host was determined to remind the world who sat on the throne of influence. Adrian Lancaster, the billionaire, stood tall at the head of the room, his tailored suit hugging his broad frame, the gleam of his cufflinks catching the candlelight. He carried himself with the ease of a man who had never known rejection, every smile practiced, every gesture controlled. His voice cut through conversations effortlessly, commanding attention even in silence. Guests leaned in when he spoke, laughed at his witticisms, and raised their glasses when he so much as lifted a hand. He wasn't simply a man hosting dinner, he was a king holding court, and every eye in the room was fixed on him. Beneath his polished charm, however, lingered arrogance, a certain sharpness to his smile that made admiration feel more like submission. In the kitchen, hidden from the opulence of the dining hall, his wife Amelia stood over the final touches of her carefully prepared dishes. Her heart beat faster with every tick of the clock. She had insisted on personally preparing the menu tonight, not just because she loved cooking but because it was her way of carving her place in a world that often treated her as an accessory to her husband's wealth. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the garnish, yet her eyes glowed with pride. This meal carried pieces of her soul, family recipes passed down by her grandmother, flavors infused with memories of warmth and love. She wanted tonight to be more than another glittering evening, she wanted it to be remembered. As she lifted the first dish to be carried out, the contrast between the two worlds became painfully clear. The dining hall, all glamour and control, and the kitchen, all heart and quiet determination. Beyond the laughter and the clinking of glasses, tension lay hidden in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The first course was carried out by the staff with practiced grace, plates set before the glittering guests like offerings at a sacred ritual. A hush fell as silver lids were lifted, revealing Amelia's carefully crafted creation, delicate soufflés, their golden tops puffed perfectly, infused with herbs she had selected with painstaking care. The aroma spread through the room like a quiet invitation, and for a moment, a few murmurs of admiration rippled among the guests. Amelia, standing discreetly at the edge of the hall, allowed herself the tiniest smile. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was there, a moment of recognition, however brief. Adrian's voice cut across the room, smooth but laced with mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, lifting his glass, "I must apologize in advance. My wife insisted on preparing tonight's meal herself. You know how it is. Sometimes passion must be indulged, even if talent is questionable." His words landed like a stone in water, sending ripples of awkwardness through the hall. Laughter broke out, forced at first, then emboldened as guests followed his lead. Amelia froze, her fingers curling against her gown as though clutching fabric could steady her racing heart. One of the investors, emboldened by Adrian's remark, quipped, "Well, if this is inedible, at least we'll have the wine to wash it down." More laughter followed, though not everyone joined in. A few guests cast Amelia sympathetic glances, but none dared speak against the man whose fortune dictated the flow of their own wealth. Adrian leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He cut into the soufflé, took a bite, and exaggerated his reaction. It's ambitious," he said, pausing just long enough for another round of chuckles. "Though perhaps a little too rustic for refined palates." His words were sharp enough to pierce, disguised in humor but designed to wound. He waved a hand dismissively, as though brushing aside her effort entirely. Amelia's cheeks burned, and she swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. She had spent hours perfecting that dish, reliving the memory of her grandmother's laughter in a sunlit kitchen, the warmth of love infused in every bite. To see it reduced to a joke, to hear her husband make her passion into an object of ridicule before strangers, was a cruelty she hadn't anticipated, though perhaps she should have. This wasn't the first time Adrian had dismissed her, but never had he done so with such public flourish. The laughter echoed in her ears, drowning out the clinking of glasses, the murmur of side conversations, the soft music playing in the background. She stood rooted in place, her heart hammering, her smile frozen into something brittle. 1,000 responses welled within her, anger, defiance, tears, but she held them all back. She knew the rules of this world. His world. Any sign of weakness would only deepen the wound. The guests continued to eat, some whispering critiques, others pretending to enjoy the food but clearly more entertained by Adrian's performance. The atmosphere was still luxurious, the chandeliers still sparkled, the wine still flowed, but beneath it all, the balance of power had been cruelly reinforced. Adrian had claimed dominance once more, using her as the means to display his superiority. And Emilia, though silent, felt something shift deep inside her. It was the sting of humiliation, yes, but also the flicker of something else. Something sharper, something that would not be so easily dismissed. The dinner carried on in a haze of laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of shallow conversation. But for Emilia, every sound blurred into a dull ringing in her ears. She stood quietly near the corner of the hall, smiling politely when eyes flickered toward her, nodding when guests addressed her, but inside, she felt hollow. The soufflés had disappeared from the tables, replaced with the next course, yet all she could think of was the sting of Adrian's voice, the laughter that followed, the pitying glances she wished she hadn't noticed. Each mocking word replayed in her mind, sharper than knives. When the final dish was served and the guests shifted to the lounge for brandy and cigars, Emilia slipped back into the kitchen. The clamor of the dining hall dulled behind the heavy oak door, replaced by the quiet clatter of dishes and the murmured chatter of the staff. Here, at least, no one laughed at her expense. She walked toward the counter where remnants of her preparation still lingered, sprigs of rosemary, a smudge of flour, the faint aroma of butter. For a long moment she simply stood there, her hands pressed against the cool marble, her shoulders trembling. And then, slowly, tears welled and spilled down her cheeks. She bent her head, stifling the sobs, unwilling even here to let them escape too loudly. Her mind drifted back to her grandmother's kitchen, warm with the scent of simmering stews and baked bread. She could see herself as a little girl, perched on a stool, flour dusting her nose while her grandmother's gentle hands guided her own. "Cooking is love made visible," her grandmother used to say, pressing a wooden spoon into her hand. Emilia had carried those words with her into adulthood, into every dish she prepared. Tonight had been no different, each soufflé had been a memory of love, a piece of her heart served to strangers. And yet, her offering had been turned into a spectacle, mocked by the very man who should have been her greatest supporter. Adrian had never understood. To him, her cooking was a hobby at best, a distraction from the role he expected her to play, a silent, beautiful ornament on his arm, a wife who smiled for the cameras and hosted lavish dinners without complaint. Her passion was irrelevant in his world of business deals and social power plays. She had hoped, foolishly, that tonight might change that he might see her for who she truly was, not just the role he had assigned her. She sank into a chair, the weight of disappointment pressing against her chest. Yet beneath the ache, a tiny ember flickered. His words had cut deep, yes, but they had also stirred something defiant within her. She thought of the recipes scribbled in her grandmother's handwriting, the notebooks filled with her own experiments, the quiet thrill of creating something beautiful out of the simplest ingredients. That was hers. It belonged to no one else, not even Adrian. Taking a shaky breath, Emilia pulled a notebook closer, one she always kept tucked away in a drawer by the kitchen. Its pages were worn, edges smudged with years of flour and oil. She opened to a blank page and began to write, not recipes this time, but a vow. Her hand trembled as she formed the words, but her resolve hardened with each letter. She would not let this be her ending. Someday, somehow, she would prove that her cooking was not a joke, not a weakness, but a gift. And when that day came, the laughter she endured tonight would no longer haunt her, it would fuel her. The days that followed the dinner party were a blur of polite routines and silent tension. Adrian carried on as though nothing had happened, striding in and out of the mansion with his usual arrogance, taking phone calls that shook the walls with his booming laughter, entertaining associates in his study with whiskey and cigars. He never once acknowledged the cruel words he had spoken about her cooking. In his mind, it had been a harmless joke, a show for his guests. To Amelia, however, it lingered like an unhealed wound. Each time she walked past the dining hall, she remembered the laughter, the looks, the sting of humiliation. She began spending more time in the kitchen, not because she wanted to please Adrian anymore, but because it was the only space in the house where she felt alive. Here, surrounded by pots, pans, and the scent of herbs, she wasn't a billionaire's wife. She was simply Amelia, the little girl who once believed she could bring joy to people with food. But the more she worked, the more the silence pressed on her. She needed someone to see her, to remind her that she wasn't invisible. That reminder came one afternoon when Sophia, an old friend who had once studied culinary arts with her before marriage, pulled Amelia's life in another direction, paid a visit. Sophia was now a respected food critic, her name carrying quiet weight in culinary circles. She had been at the dinner party, had watched the scene unfold with clenched fists and hidden fury. Now, she found Amelia alone in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, bent over a pot of broth with tears in her eyes. "You don't deserve what he did to you," Sophia said softly, breaking the silence. Amelia looked up, startled, but in her friend's eyes she found no pity, only conviction. "I tasted your food that night. Don't let his words fool you. There was heart in it, and talent. He doesn't see it because he doesn't want to, but the world will, if you let them." Amelia tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "I thought if I cooked perfectly, he would finally respect me. Instead, I made myself a fool in front of everyone." Sophia shook her head. "He made you a fool, not your food. Don't confuse the two. You have something real, Amelia. I've seen chefs crumble after years of training, but you still carry love in every dish. That's rarer than you think. Don't hide it away." Those words lodged themselves in Amelia's heart. 4 weeks afterward, Sophia became her quiet anchor. She would visit often, tasting dishes Amelia worked on, offering critiques, pushing her to refine her flavors. "More balance here," she would say, or "this needs restraint." Amelia welcomed the challenge, her notebooks filling with adjustments and notes. Every mistake became a lesson, every correction a step forward. At night, when the mansion was silent and Adrian was asleep, Amelia would sneak back into the kitchen, lighting a single lamp above the counter. She worked in secret, testing sauces, kneading dough, plating dishes with obsessive care. Sometimes the results were disasters, collapsed cakes, bitter reductions, undercooked meats, but she didn't stop. Each failure only fueled her further, as though the memory of that humiliating dinner had ignited a fire she could no longer contain. Sophia noticed the change. "You're not cooking for him anymore," she said one evening, watching Amelia slice vegetables with steady hands. "You're cooking for yourself now. That's when the magic begins." And it was true. For the first time in years, Amelia felt free in her passion. Adrian's disdain no longer silenced her, it motivated her. With Sophia's guidance, she began to see herself not as a woman mocked and dismissed, but as a chef in the making. The laughter of that night still echoed in her memory, but now it blended with another sound, the steady rhythm of her own determination, beating louder with every dish she created. The opportunity came quietly, almost like fate nudging her forward. It was Sophia who mentioned it first, her eyes glinting with a challenge Amelia hadn't expected. "There's a local cooking competition next month," she said, sliding a flyer across the counter one afternoon. "It isn't glamorous, not like the circles Adrian swims in. But the judges are serious chefs, people who care about food more than appearances. No tuxedos, no chandeliers, just kitchens, knives, and pure skill. I think you should enter." Amelia froze, staring at the flyer as though it were written in a foreign language. A competition. The word alone filled her with both excitement and dread. "Sophia, I can't. I'd be going up against professionals. What if you win?" Sophia cut in firmly. "What if you prove, not to him, not to them, but to yourself, that you are more than a joke at some dinner table? That night, Emilia lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her opulent but cold bedroom. Adrian slept soundly beside her, unbothered, dreaming perhaps of his next business conquest. She, however, kept replaying the image of that flyer in her mind. Her heart raced at the thought of failing publicly again, but beneath the fear was something fiercer, a longing to be seen, not as Adrian's wife, not as a host, but as Emilia, the chef she always wanted to be. By dawn, her decision was made. The weeks that followed were grueling. Emilia trained as though the competition were the only thing that mattered. She cooked for hours, experimenting with ingredients, testing flavor combinations, and timing her dishes with military precision. Sophia pushed her constantly, sometimes harshly, but Emilia accepted every critique with humility and resolve. Mistakes piled up, soufflés that collapsed, sauces that separated, but each failure hardened her focus. She began to trust her instincts, learning to create not just from recipes but from intuition, from the quiet voice that whispered in her grandmother's kitchen years ago. When the day of the competition arrived, Emilia's hands trembled as she stepped into the unfamiliar kitchen. The room buzzed with energy, stainless steel counters gleamed under harsh lights, chefs in crisp white coats sharpened their knives, and the judges stood with notebooks, their expressions unreadable. Emilia felt small, almost out of place among professionals who had trained for years. Dressed simply, her apron tied tightly around her waist, she reminded herself that she belonged here, if only because she refused to let fear drive her away again. The clock began, and chaos erupted. Knives hit cutting boards with rhythmic precision, pans hissed with oil, the air thickened with spices and heat. Emilia worked steadily, blocking out everything but the food in front of her. Her dish was simple yet daring: seared duck with an orange rosemary reduction, paired with root vegetables caramelized to perfection. She poured herself into every step, tasting, adjusting, listening to the instincts she had sharpened through countless secret nights in her kitchen. Still, doubt gnawed at her. She caught glimpses of other competitors plating dishes that looked like works of art, towers of food so elaborate they seemed sculpted. Her own presentation was elegant but understated, relying on flavor rather than spectacle. Would it be enough? When the time was called, Emilia set down her plate, her heart hammering in her chest. The judges moved down the line, tasting each dish with solemn care. When they reached hers, she forced herself to stand still, though every nerve in her body screamed with anticipation. They cut, chewed, exchanged brief looks. One raised an eyebrow, another scribbled notes, and for a moment, silence hung heavy. Finally, one of the judges looked up. Balanced, elegant, confidently executed. The words washed over her like a tide of relief. She nearly sagged against the counter but held herself upright, her lips curving into the faintest smile. At the end of the competition, Emilia didn't just place, she won. The applause that followed wasn't deafening, but it was real, genuine, earned. Standing on that small stage with her modest trophy in hand, she felt something ignite within her. It wasn't about Adrian anymore, nor the guests who had laughed. It was about her. For the first time in years, she believed in herself again. And that belief was worth more than any jeweled necklace Adrian could buy. Adrian remained blissfully unaware of Emilia's quiet triumph. The night she returned from the competition, still trembling with the thrill of her victory, she found him in the lounge with a glass of whiskey in hand, bragging to two associates about a new deal he had closed. He barely glanced at her when she walked in, too consumed with his own performance to notice the spark in her eyes or the subtle smile that refused to fade from her lips. To him, she was simply part of the decor, a figure meant to glide silently in and out of the room without disturbing his narrative. In the days that followed, his arrogance seemed only to grow. He relished every opportunity to flaunt his wealth, boasting about his properties abroad, the jets he was acquiring, the politicians who sought his favor. At dinners with friends, he held the floor effortlessly, his voice carrying while others nodded and laughed, desperate to remain in his orbit. When Emilia sat quietly beside him, he treated her presence as ornamental. If she dared speak, he often cut her off with a condescending joke, dismissing her words before they had the chance to land. The wound of that humiliating night still festered, and Adrian seemed intent on pressing salt into it whenever the chance arose. At one gathering, he poured himself another glass of wine and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Emilia's taken up cooking again. God help us all if she ever tries to feed the board members." Laughter rippled around the table, polite but hollow, and Emilia felt the familiar flush of heat rise in her cheeks. Yet this time, she did not crumble. Beneath her lowered lashes, her jaw tightened, and in her heart, she whispered the secret the others didn't know. She had already stood before real chefs, had already earned their respect. Adrian's words stung, but they no longer defined her. Meanwhile, he paraded around with the same careless pride, unaware of how blind he had become. The irony was sharp. While he continued to mock her hobby, dismissing it as childish indulgence, Emilia was sharpening her craft, gaining quiet strength with every dish. To him, she was still a wife whose worth existed only in the glow of his wealth. To herself, however, she was becoming something far greater, though Adrian, wrapped in his arrogance, could not yet see it. It happened almost by accident, though later Emilia would think of it as fate stepping in at precisely the right moment. Sophia had convinced her to volunteer at a small charity event hosted in the city, an unassuming evening designed to raise funds for a children's hospital. Unlike the glamorous galas Adrian favored, this gathering was modest. No grand chandeliers or crystal centerpieces, only folding tables covered in white cloths, strings of fairy lights twinkling softly overhead, and the laughter of children echoing in the background. Emilia agreed to cook for the event quietly, knowing Adrian would never bother to attend such a humble affair. She poured her heart into the menu: roasted lamb glazed with pomegranate, fresh-baked bread with herb butter, and a dessert inspired by her grandmother's recipe, honey cakes layered with cream and a hint of cardamom. It wasn't extravagant, but it was soulful, each dish crafted with care and love. As she worked in the bustling kitchen, surrounded by volunteers and the cheerful chaos of service, Emilia felt lighter than she had in years. For once, she wasn't cooking to impress billionaires or to seek Adrian's approval. She was cooking for people who simply wanted a good meal, and that made her feel free. Among the guests that evening was a man Emilia didn't recognize at first. He moved quietly through the room, sampling food here and there, speaking to no one in particular. His presence was unassuming, his attire simple compared to the glittering suits and gowns she was used to. But when he stopped at her table and tasted her lamb, something in his expression shifted. He took another bite, slower this time, then set his fork down carefully, as though weighing every flavor. Finally, he looked up at her. "You cooked this?" he asked. Emilia nodded nervously. "Yes, I did." He studied her, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You have a gift. Do you know who I am?" She shook her head, her palms suddenly damp. He smiled faintly. "My name is Henri Dubois. I review restaurants for Le Gourmet Journal." The name struck her like lightning. Henri Dubois was a legend in the culinary world, a critic whose words could make or break a restaurant overnight. That he had tasted her food at all was staggering. That he seemed impressed, unbelievable. "You should be cooking for more than charity events," Henri said firmly. "Your flavors are clean, balanced, memorable. Apply for serious recognition. If you keep working at this level, you could reach Michelin standards." The words stunned her. Michelin standards. She had read about them, dreamed about them in quiet moments, but to hear them spoken aloud by someone like Henri felt surreal. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she could only nod. After he left, Emilia stood frozen, her heart racing, her mind whirling. Sophia found her later, still dazed, staring at the empty plate where Henry's lamb had been. "What did he say?" Sophia asked eagerly. Emilia's lips parted, trembling as she whispered, "He told me I could reach Michelin." From that night forward, everything changed. Emilia's secret practices became more rigorous, her nights longer, her notebooks thicker with notes and sketches of plating ideas. She researched obsessively, studying the techniques of the world's greatest chefs, pushing herself beyond comfort. She wasn't merely cooking anymore, she was preparing for something bigger than she had ever imagined. The dream that had once seemed like a fragile ember was now a roaring flame. She didn't know how long the road would be or how many challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in her life, she felt that her passion had a place in the world. And no amount of Adrian's mockery could dim that truth. The night of the Michelin ceremony arrived like a dream she had never dared believe would come true. The venue was a grand hall in the heart of the city, nothing like the charity event where Henri Dubois had first tasted her food. Crystal lights gleamed above rows of white-clothed tables. A stage stood at the front crowned with a red banner embossed with the words Michelin Recognition Gala, and the air buzzed with the energy of the culinary world's finest. Chefs in crisp whites mingled with critics, journalists, and industry icons, their conversations a blend of passion, rivalry, and anticipation. Emilia stood at the edge of the crowd, her gown simple yet elegant, her hair pinned back with quiet grace. She clutched Sophia's hand tightly, her heart pounding as though it might burst. She had spent months pouring herself into dishes that demanded perfection, dishes she had tested again and again, sometimes collapsing in exhaustion but always rising to try once more. She had burned, cut, and doubted herself countless times, but she had also grown, refining her art until her cooking no longer felt like imitation but pure creation. Tonight, it was all about to be tested. On the stage, the announcer began to read the names of chefs being recognized. Applause filled the room as one after another was called, each name accompanied by gasps and cheers. Emilia's palms grew clammy, her breath shallow. A part of her whispered that she didn't belong here, that this was still Adrian's world, not hers. But another voice, stronger now than it had ever been, reminded her of every tear she had shed in her kitchen, every notebook filled with recipes, every moment she had chosen not to give up. And now, the announcer said, his voice echoing across the hall, our final Michelin Star recognition tonight goes to Emilia Lancaster, for her innovative yet soulful approach to classical cuisine. The world seemed to stop. For a heartbeat, Emilia couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the sound of applause crashed over her, thunderous and unrelenting. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling in approval. Sophia nudged her forward, and with trembling steps, Emilia made her way to the stage. The announcer handed her the certificate and the iconic Michelin plaque, its weight both literal and symbolic in her arms. She blinked against the hot sting of tears as flashes from cameras blinded her, reporters scribbling furiously. 4 years, she had been invisible, dismissed, ridiculed. Now, she stood under the brightest lights, her name celebrated, her passion vindicated. In that moment, memories surged through her, Adrian's mocking laughter, the guests chuckling at her expense, the pity in their eyes as she stood humiliated. She remembered retreating into the kitchen that night, tears dripping onto her grandmother's recipe notebook, vowing to prove herself. And here she was. She had done it. From the corner of the room, she caught sight of Adrian. He had come, perhaps expecting another chance to boast about his charming wife's hobby. But his face now was unreadable, a mask cracking under the weight of disbelief. The man who had laughed loudest when she was mocked now sat in stunned silence as the world applauded her. The applause swelled louder, filling the hall with energy Emilia thought might lift her off the ground. She raised the plaque slightly, her lips parting in a soft smile. This wasn't just an award, it was her triumph, her reclamation of self. Every humiliation, every sleepless night, every failure had led to this shining moment. She had not only cooked, she had risen. As she stepped off the stage, Sophia embraced her tightly. I told you, she whispered, her voice thick with pride. The world would see you. And they had. The applause still echoed in Emilia's ears long after she stepped off the stage. Cameras flashed, journalists crowded around her, and industry leaders offered handshakes and congratulations. For the first time, she felt the warmth of recognition not as Adrian's wife, but as Emilia, the chef who had earned her place among the best. Yet she knew the moment of confrontation with Adrian was inevitable. His pride would never allow him to remain silent while she stood in the spotlight he believed belonged only to him. She didn't have to wait long. He approached her during the reception, his jaw tight, his smile thin and strained, the kind of expression he wore when the world refused to bend to his will. Guests stepped aside, sensing the tension radiating off him. Well, Adrian said, his voice dripping with a forced charm, Congratulations, darling. Quite the surprise. His eyes darted toward the plaque in her hands, lingering as though it were a weapon aimed at his ego. Thank you, Emilia replied softly, her tone calm but firm. There was no mockery in her words, no trembling in her voice. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The plaque in her hand spoke louder than anything she could say. Adrian leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Don't get carried away. You think a little star makes you important. You're here because of me. Because of my name, my influence. Don't forget that. Emilia met his gaze steadily, something she had rarely done before. No, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. I'm here because of me. Because of every night I stayed awake perfecting dishes while you laughed. Because of every tear I shed when you mocked me. You tried to make me small, Adrian, but all you did was give me reason to rise. His face darkened, the mask of arrogance slipping as he realized the balance between them had shifted. Around them, guests whispered, their eyes flickering between the billionaire and his wife, now recognized as a Michelin Star chef. The very society that once laughed with him now applauded her, their loyalties silently shifting as they sensed where the true power lay. Adrian forced a laugh, trying to salvage the moment, but it rang hollow. Well, enjoy your moment, he sneered, straightening his jacket. Let's see how long it lasts. With that, he turned sharply and stalked away, his departure noticed by more people than he would have liked. Emilia exhaled slowly, her body trembling, not from fear, but from release. 4 years, she had lived under his shadow, shrinking each time he dismissed her. Tonight, the roles had reversed. She no longer needed his approval, his wealth, or his name. The world had seen her, and in that seeing, it had set her free. As she looked around at the crowd of admirers, at Sophia beaming with pride, at strangers eager to taste her creations, Emilia realized Adrian's humiliation was not her victory, it was his consequence. Her true triumph was standing here, unbroken, finally recognized for the woman she had always been. The weeks that followed the ceremony were a whirlwind of change. Emilia's name appeared in magazines, her story retold in articles that praised not just her food but her resilience. Reservations poured in for her newly opened restaurant, a place she had dreamed about for years but never thought possible. The space was warm and elegant, not ostentatious like Adrian's mansion, but welcoming, a reflection of her soul. Copper pans hung from the walls, the aroma of fresh herbs filled the air, and each dish carried the same quiet love her grandmother had once taught her to cherish. Guests left not only full but moved, speaking of flavors that lingered in memory. Adrian, meanwhile, faded into the background. His arrogance still carried him through boardrooms and banquets, but the glow that once surrounded him had dimmed. People now spoke of Emilia with respect and admiration, and when they mentioned him at all, it was often with a hint of pity. The man who had mocked his wife's cooking was now overshadowed by her star, his laughter at her expense remembered as the foolishness that fueled her rise. On a quiet evening, long after the last guest had left her restaurant, Emilia stood alone in the kitchen. The lights were dim, save for the soft glow above the counter where her Michelin plaque rested. She touched it gently, not with pride alone but with gratitude, for the pain that had pushed her, the failures that had taught her, and the courage that had carried her here. Her journey was no longer about proving Adrian wrong. It was about proving herself right. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights sparkling before her, Emilia smiled. A new dawn had come, one she had created with her own hands, her own heart. She was no longer a shadow in someone else's story, she was the author of her own.